Terry O'Reilly is an award-winning advertising and marketing practitioner. He's well known across Canada for his CBC Radio series, Under the Influence. Prior to that, the program was called The Age of Persuasion. Terry is one of the most insightful creative people in the country. He understands the power of marketing and how important the power of big ideas can be when trying to connect with customers. He's a well-received speaker. People like Microsoft, McDonald's, Rotman School of Business, the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, and dozens more have engaged Terry to share his marketing and creative insights. In addition, Terry is a best-selling author. He's written 3 books, and the most recent is called My Best Mistake: Epic Fails and Silver Linings. It's a book about how some big breakthroughs and great products all started with a mistake. Now, as if this isn't enough to keep a busy guy going, Terry and his family founded the Apostrophe Podcast Network, which, in addition to featuring Under the Influence episodes, also presents Backstage at the Vinyl Cafe, the Canadian Star System with Steve Patterson, Surviving Life with Les Stroud, and many others. Let's join Terry O'Reilly as we talk to him from his sumptuous recording studio, which also happens to be an Airstream trailer. Terry, thanks very much for taking time to chat with me today. It's been a long time since we've seen each other. You're a lot taller, I'm a lot shorter. Who would have guessed?
Great to see you too, Mike.
It is. It's nice to have you here. And I want to start on this lovely little journey we're going to take right at the beginning. And I'm wondering, how did you first get into creative writing?
Well, let me think about that. It's a funny thing. If I go back to my grade school years, Mike, I never thought much about writing or English class, it was just another class I had to study. And every time I would write a story in English class, I would get a really high mark on it. And it just always astounded me because I just didn't put any effort into it. It was just one of the things I had to do. And I had some teachers who really encouraged me, who I think saw something in me. So I think that lit a spark. And then I went to Ryerson to study radio and television in Toronto, because I was born in Sudbury, moved to Toronto to go to Ryerson. And I fell in love with advertising. And it was due to one morning, we had no advertising classes, by the way, back in Ryerson at that time. But every Wednesday morning, we would have a lecture series where somebody from the industry would come in, tell us about their work. It could be a documentary filmmaker. It could be, I remember Lloyd Robertson came in to talk about announcing the news. The Friendly Giant came in to talk about producing children's programming. That was the joy of being in Toronto, of course. But one day, advertising people came in and just talked about what it was like to be in advertising, coming up with concepts and writing slogans and taglines and writing storylines and commercials and filming commercials and working with actors. And I sat in the back of that class, Mike, and I saw my future.
Wow.
That was the moment I said, okay, I know where in this broadcast world I'm going to end up. And it was advertising. So when I got out of Ryerson in 1981, it was a recession, tough time to find a job. I sent out a couple of dozen resumes to advertising agencies across the country, got rejected by all of them. But then I managed to find a job, a copywriting job at FM 108 in Burlington. And that's where I met your brother, Peter. I didn't want to only write radio. I wanted to be in an advertising agency, but this was a copywriting job and I was just glad to have it. And then I was really writing full time. And that's where I really got into writing.
Now, as you started to hone your craft writing for this almost local radio station,
Sure.
Wasn't a very big transmitter, as I recall, but
Right. That's so true.
How did you make the jump to Toronto? Did you do the jump, or did someone answer one of your letters? How did that come about?
I stayed at that radio station for probably a little under 2 years. Then I got hired at a small advertising company in Burlington. That was my first blush at a small advertising agency. So I started doing work on all mediums, not much television there, but a lot of print and radio. But I always wanted to get back to Toronto to get a shot at a big advertising agency. So one day I just decided I would start working on a portfolio at home. So every night I would just start dreaming up ideas to put together a portfolio that I could present to creative directors. And when I felt that was ready, I got on the phone and one morning, I made something like 60 or 70 phone calls to
Wow.
Toronto to try and get appointments with creative directors. Mostly because I had to call back 6 or 7 or 8 times just to get a single creative director on the phone. Because as you know, my creative directors are the busiest people on the planet. I managed to get 4 interviews, which is quite amazing in hindsight, I think, because I really didn't have much to offer. And I went and had an appointment with the very first creative director, who was Trevor Goodgall, at an agency called Campbell Ewald. He flipped through my portfolio so fast that I didn't think he was taking any of it in. He just like flipped right through it. And then he said, "I'll take you on for 2 weeks." And I said, "Oh, okay. Will you keep me on if you like me?" And he said, "We'll see about that." And then 2 weeks later, I was hired full time.
Wow.
That was my first big agency experience. Yeah. And it was a good one because he became my mentor. He was fantastic.
Well, and from that point, you went to a few other agencies in Toronto as well.
That's right. I worked for I think 3 of the most creative advertising agencies in Toronto at that time, which would be the 80s. I worked at Campbell Ewald, where we won hundreds of awards under Trevor's guidance. Then I worked for Doyle Dane Bernbach, who I think was the greatest agency that ever was. And then I worked for Shia Day, which at that time was the
Oh,
hottest
wow.
agency in North America. And then from there, I started my own company.
Well, it's interesting because here you are moving up through what I'll call the heady ranks of the creative world in Toronto. And suddenly I'm hearing from people, oh, Terry's got a company called Pirate Radio and Television. And my first response was, really? And of course, Pirate Radio and Television became, I think, one of the hottest go-to companies in Toronto for creative radio and television commercials. How did Pirate come about?
You know, at that time, early in my career, when I looked into the future, I saw myself as eventually becoming a creative director at a top advertising agency. That was always my goal. I dreamt about it. I thought about it. I dreamed about it. And then once I got into the agency world, which was wonderful, I got to a point within 4 years of thinking I want to be my own boss. And which was very different to being a creative director working for a big company. It was like a complete 180 on that decision. So the thing I loved to do most was radio, Mike. And where I fell in love with radio was, of course, at FM 108. That's the serendipity of life, right? I didn't really want to be there. I go there because it's the only job I can find. And don't I fall in love with radio? Then when I got into advertising agency life, I quickly realized that most writers were afraid of radio. They felt at first blush it didn't have the same amount of tools, like there was no locations, no faces, no wardrobe, where I always thought that was the most freeing thing about radio. You could be in a heart valve with some great writing and some sound effects, or at the top of Mount Everest or at the bottom of the ocean. You could literally create that, where you couldn't do that with television. It would just be too expensive. So radio became this thing that I was able to make my name with, because when everybody ran away from radio, I would take the brief, run back into my office and just have fun with radio. And because most writers were afraid of radio, I saw there was a gap in the market, so to speak, that whenever I brought my radio to a production company, whether it be Toronto, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, because I worked all over the place, I almost always ended up fighting with the director to try and save my script, because they wanted to turn it inside out and, dump the sell and stay with the humor. And it just made me crazy. And I thought over time that there had to be a better way. That was what I call my fist slam moment, where, an entrepreneur slams their fist on the table and says, there has got to be a better way than this. So I decided to start a radio company originally called, and I had a partner too, who was also in the production business, and we started Pirate Radio. It was before it was Pirate Radio and television. And just as an end note on this, what I wanted to do was create a company I could not find, which was a company that respected a writer's script, that guarded it, that protected it, and also made it the best it could be. So that was really the genesis of Pirate, was to create a safe place for writers.
And of course, over the years, Pirate became so well known because of all the awards that you received. And there were some big awards that you brought home. And I always used to look forward to the radio reels from the RSB and the Pirate Radio winners were always not only fun to listen to, but they were damn instructive as well.
Well,
you can learn a lot by listening to other people.
That's high praise. You know, one interesting thing, I'll just jump back in the story, which I think your listeners might find interesting. When I was leaving Chiat to start my company, the president of Chiat pulled me aside and said, I have to tell you something. You'll never make a living doing radio. It's just, of all the mediums, it's the lowest on the ladder. You just have to know you'll never make a living doing that. And I felt so different than that. You know how Malcolm Gladwell has this interesting insight that most entrepreneurs, what they have in common is not an appetite for risk, but rather they believe they're onto a sure thing. And I felt so differently than what he felt. I just knew that there was a niche. Not only was it a place to protect writers, Mike, but I wanted to create a company that was different. In other words, every radio studio I'd ever been in up until that point in my career was always in a basement of a building with no windows and really bad furniture. And when it was lunchtime, they'd give you some greasy takeout menus. And it was just this horrible experience. So the place we created, Pirate, it was windows. And it was bright, and we made all the studios look like beautiful Muskoka cottages. And we brought in 5-star catering every day for our clients. And I fed my staff breakfast every morning. We had 5-star catering for lunch. And we just created, and even the studios had windows in them, not just where the control room, but the floor space where the actors were had windows. So we created a radio production company that had really never existed before, in not just conceptually, but in its actual design.
Very different kind of place.
Yeah.
You know, and the results certainly proved themselves. You did incredibly well. And then I'm listening to CBC and I hear this thing called The Age of Persuasion. Here's Terry O'Reilly. And again, I start to shake my head and I go, what on earth is he up to now? How on earth did Age of Persuasion come about?
For many years at Pirate, I would hold creative radio seminars. So I would rent a theater in downtown Toronto that would seat about 200 people. And I would invite young ad writers to come from all over the country. And I would feed them breakfast, give them lunch, have an open bar at the end of the day. And then I would stand on that stage mic for 7 hours and tell them everything I'd learned about radio. Because I was directing 500 commercials a year at that point.
Wow.
And if you do the math, I think my staff did the math one day. I think in my career, I directed something like 14,000 commercials, something like that. So I'd seen so many brilliant solutions and dead ends and bad scripts and great scripts. So I tried to impart everything I'd ever learned about radio in that seminar. So I would do that every year. One day, I was out to lunch with 2 of my buddies that worked at radio stations in Toronto. And one of them was Larry McGinnis, this wonderful copywriter who worked for Chum. And he said to me one day over lunch, you know that seminar you do? I said, yeah. He said, that would make a great radio series. And I said, who would ever run that? And he thought for a moment and he said, CBC. And I said, the advertising-free CBC would run a show on advertising. And he said, I think they'd run that show. And then we laughed and we had our beers in the sunshine. And then I couldn't get that thought out of my mind for the next week or two. And then another friend of mine who was at that lunch said to me, you want to go pitch that idea of Larry's to CBC? And I said, yeah, I think I do. So we managed to get a meeting at CBC, and we walked into the boardroom and gave the shortest pitch you've ever heard, Mike. It was essentially this. We said, most people hate advertising. It's intrusive, annoying. They wish it would just go away. I said, but actually, advertising is a fascinating business because it's the study of human nature. And nobody studies human nature closer than advertisers. I said, I'm not a journalist. I'm not a pundit. I'm not an academic. I'm a working ad man in the trenches with access and stories. And I want to bring the public backstage. And there was a big pause in the room. And then Chris Boyce, who was head of CBC Radio, said, we'll take it. Which was shocking to me, like, because honest to God, going up the elevator that day, I said to my buddy, I don't think they'll ever buy this show, but maybe we can make a relationship, and maybe down the road we'll eventually end up doing something else with them. So when they said we'll take it, the dog had caught the car. So suddenly we had to figure out how to mount a national radio show, and that's how.
Your greatest hope would be that they would say, well, do us a demo.
Yeah.
Let's hear a sample, but we'll take it.
Yeah.
That's a
Yeah.
home run.
No, I know. It was so shocking to us. Then just the next beat, they take us on for 8 weeks. It was kind of, they took us on as a summer replacement show. So when one of their big shows went on hiatus, our show popped in for the summer. And when just as the first episode was airing, Mike, we braced ourselves for blowback from CBC listeners. Like, good God, here was a show about advertising and marketing coming on our sacred airwaves. So we just kind of braced ourselves. And the reaction was the exact opposite. It was wonderful. It was warm. People said they were curious. They said, tell us more. This is really interesting. And we got this avalanche of email, and it was all wonderful, warm, and encouraging. And so that's about halfway, maybe about 4 or 5 weeks into our 8-week show, CBC said to us, we're going to keep you on as a continuing show, not just a summer hiatus. So then we realized we had a longer arc than we thought we had.
And on the show, it ran for a number of years, and then it morphed into something called Under the Influence. And was that a name change, or was it an attitude change?
My producing partner, Mike Tennant, who I'd done the show with, left to do other things. He had cachet with CBC now, and he wanted to do his own project. So I was kind of left in this kind of intersection of, what am I going to do with the show now? And here's the important thing. It was really a total retooling of the age of persuasion, because in 2005, when the show started, there was no YouTube, no Facebook, no iPhone, no digital media, everything had changed in the intervening years between 2005 and 2011. So I broadened the aperture of the show. Age of Persuasion was about advertising. Under the Influence was about marketing. And suddenly marketing wasn't about a one-way voice, pounding sales messages into listeners. It was really subtle influence was starting to happen with influencers, and like everything about social media and algorithms, and everything was becoming a little more subtle and a little bit, and it was a two-way street now. People could actually tweet something at a company. It wasn't just a one-way conversation anymore. So anyway, I took that opportunity to totally retool the show and not only rename it, but to broaden the aperture from advertising to marketing, which is a much bigger umbrella.
One of the things that didn't change was the delivery of the show, and your storytelling ability is pretty unique. And my brother and I have often said, yeah, we've copied Terry certain times when we're doing commercials, because you have that cadence that you put to the show, and it's so very warm and pulls people into the content so beautifully. Was that deliberate, or is that just you?
That's my only gear, Mike. That's my ranges from A to A minus. So honestly, it's not intentional. It's just, I think that's just my narrating gear. I think that's what that is. It's because the show is really a narration of stories. So that's really, it's just an automatic gear I go into. It isn't anything more than that.
Well, you're very, very fortunate.
Well, well,
Um,
listen, the weird thing about that too, Mike, is I'd never really been in front of a microphone prior to that because I was always a director. I was always
yes.
directing actors. I was never there. And even when Mike Tennant and I pitched the show to CBC, then they said, we'll take it. And then Mike and I were developing the show. I had assumed that we were going to be co-hosts on it. And then Mike said to me, I don't want to host it. I think you should host it alone. And I panicked. I said, what? Because I had never done anything like that. I didn't even know if I was capable of it, of handling a show or shouldering an entire show. But anyway, as it turns out.
Well, the world has continued to evolve for you, and people may or may not know that your wife and two daughters are in the business as well. How did you trick them into coming on board?
Well, the Under the Influence podcast became very successful. And I was sitting there one day thinking, that what this country doesn't have, this is going back a little ways now, is a lot of podcast networks, Canadian podcast networks. There were a lot of American ones, but not many Canadian ones. And I wondered if we could create a podcast company and a podcast network where we could put out great podcasts. So I approached my wife and two of our three daughters. My oldest daughter lives in London, England, but I approached two of our other daughters. I said, "Would you be interested in starting a company with me, a podcast production company?" And I explained what I had in mind, and because I wanted to start a family company, a family-based company, because everybody, right, Mike? Everybody has a superpower. And my wife has this incredible superpower of keeping a fast-moving train on the tracks. She is just brilliant at that. And one of my other daughters is a wonderful writer. She took journalism. She became this wonderful, wonderful writer. And my other daughter is this incredibly gifted graphic designer and audio director. Like they really all had these superpowers, better than mine, I may add. And I thought together, collectively, we were a pretty impressive little company. And the other thing is, my wife and I wanted to teach our daughters how to become entrepreneurs. So we decided to do it. So we called it the Apostrophe Podcast Company because the apostrophe in our last name, O'Reilly, is the bane of our existence because the digital world does not recognize apostrophes. When I go to check into a hotel, they can never find me. As I say, eliminate the apostrophe, and they go, "Oh, there you are!" It's just this. Anyway, that was the joke on the name, and we've have this wonderful humming company that's incredibly busy, and we have a number of podcasts, and we're just loving it.
Well, the production, for a lot of the production, is done just a few feet from your home in your very own Airstream trailer. As a matter of fact, we're talking to you today as you are in your production Airstream. How long have you had the Airstream as a production facility?
I would say probably about 6 years. Yeah. Prior to that, as I was mentioning before we started recording, Mike, I lived in Creemore for many years, which was 2 hours north of Toronto. And on record day, I would have to drive into Toronto, 2 hours there, 2 hours back for a half-hour recording, to record a half-hour show. It took longer than a half hour, but to record a half-hour show. And after 10 years, it was starting to kill me because, the drive home was inching on the 427 every day. You're literally inching home for 2 hours.
Yeah.
And I just said, I can't do it anymore. And my wife, I always loved Airstream trailers. I'm not a trailer guy, but I love the aesthetic of an Airstream trailer, just the aluminum roundness, just loved. And we were talking about that one day. And my wife suddenly said to me, "Could you build a recording studio in an Airstream trailer?" And I thought, oh my God, that is just an absolutely brilliant idea. Because at the time we had a cottage and a home, so I could just, bring my recording studio to wherever we happened to be. Like I wasn't tethered to Toronto anymore. So I looked around for a 1960s era Airstream, and I found one remarkably not far from our home. It was in Cambridge. I thought I'd have to go to the US to find one, but I found one in Cambridge, 1969 Airstream trailer. Then I had to find somebody who knew how to restore a trailer. Then I had to find somebody who knew how to build a recording studio in a trailer. So I did my homework on Google, and I found a lot of people who could restore Airstreams, but nobody who also could build a recording studio in them. And then one day I find this guy who does both. He restores Airstreams and he builds studios. He did edit bays in Airstreams for Hollywood studios. He did trailers for Hollywood celebrities that I guess they use when they're on location. So I'm scrolling down. He's doing beautiful work too, by the way. I'm scrolling down his website thinking, where in California are you? And I get to his address and he's in Nova Scotia.
Oh my goodness.
He's a transplanted Californian who had moved to Nova Scotia. So I called him up. I said, have you ever done a radio studio in an Airstream? He said, no, but I'd love to try. So my wife and I, the very first time we ever pulled a trailer, Mike, we pulled it out to Nova Scotia. Had to get on a ferry at one point. You can imagine how terrifying that was. And I left it with him for a year. And then when I went to pick it up, I just couldn't believe the job he had done. It was absolutely beautiful. And here we are. We're 6 years later in our recording
And it
studio.
obviously works really well.
It's beautiful. Yeah, and I'm in the winter. I've got 3 different heating sources in here. I've got air conditioning in the summer. I've got in-floor heating. It's just it's a cozy little beautiful studio.
Let me ask you about a typical episode. I've often wondered when I listen to an episode of Under the Influence, is that built upon a theme idea, or is it from some information that you found out about some companies?
I have an ongoing list of themes. And the great thing about, as you know, Mike, from your long career in advertising, this industry is spits out great ideas every day. And there's always something happening in the world of advertising that's fascinating. So I really do my homework. So every morning, my routine is from about 8:30 to almost noon every day, I read. So I read all my marketing, Ad Age, Ad Week, strategy, campaign. I read the Wall Street Journal, the Globe and Mail, the New York Times. I do a lot of reading, so I'm always looking for stories. I'll make little notes to myself on this. This would be an interesting theme to pursue. And listeners also, by the way, send me great ideas on, hey, Terry, why don't you do a show on, famous ad slogans? And I'll go, that's a great idea. I haven't done that yet. So between the reading I do and listeners, I come up with a long list of themes. Some of the themes, Mike, I know a lot about, and some of the themes I know nothing about. So the biggest part of our show is research. That's
And
the toughest part of our show.
am I getting the picture that you do most of the research and the writing for the show?
So what I'll do is I'll research if I decide on a topic. So I got a show that's coming out soon. I was just listening to a mix today on brand movies. So this show is about movies that are made about brands. So Barbie, Air about Nike. I don't know if you've seen that movie that Ben Affleck directed about how Nike signed Jordan's fantastic movie. The Founder about how McDonald's was founded. And there's another one I'm forgetting now. Anyway, that show, I did a lot of research on that. I would research that idea, maybe do about 10 or 15 hours of research. Then I would create a research assignment, and then I would send that to one of our researchers. We have 4 researchers on the show, and I would give them specific stories to chase. And then they'll come back. I'll give them 2 weeks to find that research. They'll come back. They'll send me usually over 100 pages of research.
Wow.
I'll have my own 50 pages of research that I did in order to create the research assignment that got sent to them. It'll take me 3 days to read through 150 pages of research. I'll then have to form the show in my head, and then I'll start writing it. I do write all the shows, and it takes me about 2 days to write the show. And then it goes to our chief sound engineer, Jeff Devine. I'll, explain to Jeff how I hear the show. He'll put the show together. I'll record my voiceover, send it to Jeff. Jeff will assemble the show, send it back to me. I usually do about 20 tweaks per show. Like, can you move this 1 second, 10 frames earlier? I'm going to change this music track because I don't like it once I hear it. And then we'll do 1 revision or maybe 2, and then the show's ready to go. So at any given time, we're juggling 5 episodes. So 1 is being researched, 1 is being written, 1 is being recorded, 1 is being tweaked, and 1 is being scheduled.
It
And
sounds
my wife,
like
Debbie, keeps all those balls in the air because she is the maestro of keeping. And we do, not to bore you, Mike, but we do a version for CBC, Then we do a podcast version, which is usually a little longer because I'm not tethered by time. We're on WBEZ in Chicago. We're on Sirius Satellite. And then we have our subscriber version, which is we do a version of a show, or we'll do a bonus episode of a show that only goes out to our subscribers. So we've got so much content swirling around at any given time.
I must admit, one of the things that really concerns me about your podcast is that quite often I have to spend 10, 15 minutes in the driveway until the show is finished.
Well, you know, that is our company slogan, by the way. That is our tagline. We produce driveway podcasts. That's always our goal. And you can see that on our website. We say we try to produce driveway podcasts, that we try and keep you in the car, in the parking lot, at the grocery store till the show's over. That's the ultimate compliment you could give us, and that's our ultimate goal every time.
The only show that, other than that ever did that to me was As It Happens.
Yeah.
And I used to listen to that driving home from work, and I would have to stay in the driveway to hear the end. And I find exactly the same with Under the Influence. It's just a great series. Now, all the writing that you've done, I guess it's a natural outgrowth that you would write a book, and now you've written 3 books. And did that come about because you found yourself with all this great content?
One day I got a call from a senior editor at Knopf, which is a division of Random House, and she said, "I'm a fan of the show. Would you be interested in writing a book?" And I said, "I would love to write a book." So we had a couple of meetings, and that's where how the first book came about. The second book, my show is not aimed at marketers, right, Mike? That's a very important thing to say. My show is aimed at the average Canadian. I'm trying to explain how advertising works, get them behind the scenes. Why does the worst commercial of the year sell the most product? Let's investigate that. Or why does the color blue? Why is that the world's most favorite color, regardless of the country? Why is blue the color? And how is that persuasive? And how to market? So it's always aimed at the average Canadian. But my second book, I wanted to actually aim at marketers, to take all the knowledge that I had gleaned from my own career and from all the research I've done over, this is my 19th season on CBC, and put it into a book for marketers who didn't have a big advertising agency, for marketers who don't have an advertising agency on speed dial. So that was that book. And then the third book was really one that was just a fun idea that I kind of loved, where I wanted to tell stories of people who made catastrophic career decisions, and they felt that they had almost ruined their livelihood and ruined their careers, but it ended up being the best thing that ever happened to them. So that was my best mistake.
And that leads me into another kind of question. You've been described as an ad man, and I guess that's true. I've always thought of you as a creative communicator, and you've done a lot of that in the speaking engagements that you've done to blue chip companies, but you've also given addresses to government bodies, public organizations, and not-for-profits as well. And I wonder what you say to people when they say, "Oh, I'm not clever enough to do that. I don't have enough budget. I don't have the people." What's your best advice to people like that?
The best work Pirate ever did historically was for the smallest clients, the ones that had very little budget. And I think the reason we did the best work for them, Mike, was for a number of reasons. One was we were usually sitting across the table from the owner, from the decision maker. So there wasn't a bureaucracy in the middle that waters down our ideas. We had a direct flow to the decision maker. Number two, those small companies were very entrepreneurial. So they knew they needed to get a bigger bang for their small bucks. So they were willing to take calculated risks. They were willing to do some work that was outrageous or, unusual in whatever manner that was. They didn't want safe advertising because they knew they couldn't afford safe advertising because their budget was so limited. So I say to people who think, I have a small budget, or, I don't have a big advertising agency. I think find creative people, because creative people always want a challenge, always want an opportunity. And I think creativity is the last, as Bill Bernbach once said, the last legal advantage that a company has over its competition is creativity, right? So that, I think it all comes down to how creative you are. What's the idea? What's the selling idea? And I think you can always win with really smart work. I think budget, if big, as they say, if big was the way to win, then, the elephant would be king of the jungle, right?
Good point. Good
Yeah.
point. Well, these are very complicated times, and as your program Under the Influence captures on each of its episodes, people are exposed to media messages literally every minute of their day on their phone, on their computer, on their tablet. Is there anything that concerns you about communications today?
Well, I think that is one of the biggest concerns I have, is there's too much advertising out there. I've always said that there's too much advertising. I hate the ads on the boards of hockey games. I always have. Now they've, putting ads under the ice, so they're skating over them. Curling rinks are full of it's too much, and I think it's detrimental to the industry. I think it just gets under people's skin. The other thing I really have always hated since it appeared, and I always talk about it on my show, is I don't like algorithms silently chasing consumers. I think and you can see how the backlash is already happening, where cookies are not being allowed, and Apple's, respecting people's privacy and, getting rid of cookies. I think Google is too. And I think that had to come, that reckoning had to come, because, if companies act like submarines, kind of quietly tracking you, I just think that there's something horrible about that. That the great thing about advertising, and it's the thing people either love or hate about the business, is you always knew what an ad was trying to do. Like when you saw an ad, you go, that ad's trying to sell me something. But when it went underground, when it went into algorithms and using pixels to track your online history, and looking for, if you're going to websites to buy a car, and then, they start tracking you. And then when you go to a financing site, they know that you're really close to buying, then they'll send you a couple of, save $1,500 on this Ford F-150. I mean, all of that is not good.
Yeah. I think
So
that's true. I think that's true. How about the O'Reillys? What's in the future for you and your team? More under the influence, more of the same, some new
Yeah.
horizons?
We're in our 19th season of Under the Influence, so that is a wonderful thing. We have another really wonderful show called We Regret to Inform You, the Rejection Podcast, which is one of our original shows too, which I co-host with one of my daughters. And it tells the story of all the rejections famous people had in their careers. Because when you look at a famous or, successful person, you think, boy, they knocked it out of the park. But when you really get into their lives, most of them were rejected numerous times, like just incredible debilitating career obstacles. And then when you see how they overcame them all to become successful, that is an incredibly inspiring thing. So every episode takes you on a story trip from where this person gets an idea to the moment they become successful, not what happens after, but to the moment where they make it. And we analyze how they got over all the obstacles. So that show's had over 2 million downloads. So that's a wonderful thing.
Wow.
And I'm reading my fourth book, sorry, right now, about people who go against the grain, the people who refuse to go by conventional theories, and come in the back door on ideas, and did it by going through the path less traveled, which I'm always fascinated by.
Well, to kind of wrap this all up, I guess all I can say is, first of all, I'm glad you don't have to travel far to the office.
Yes, thank you.
I think that's very nice. Your success to date and your influence on the media that you've been a part of, I think are well appreciated by not only people like myself who've been in the business, but so many Canadians. And you probably know from all the fan letters that you've received, how much people appreciate it. And I guess I just want to say to you and to your wife, Debbie, and your daughters, Callie and Sydney, all best regards for the future. And thanks very much for sharing the Under the Influence story today.
Well, thank you for having me, Mike. I always enjoy talking to you. It's always fun.